Hi, I'm Davy. I'm awesome. And welcome to Davy's Awesome Wrestling, where I review wrestling-related things, all from the perspective of a fan, not an insider. So this week, I'm reviewing Season 4 of the Vice series, Dark Side of the Ring. Took a while to get on Hulu, so I could watch it in the US, because it's a Canadian show. But it's a great show. It's been around since 2019. So let's get into Season 4, where it kicks off with Chris and Tammy, the story of Chris Candido and Tammy Lynn Sitch. Talking about how they met as teenagers, got together. Chris was getting into wrestling. Tammy was going to go to college until Chris got into Smoky Mountain, and Jim Cornette wanted Tammy a part of it. And they both were doing great in Smoky Mountain. They got a call up from WWF, where they became the Body Donnas, Sonny and Skip. It wasn't really working out, so they added Dr. Tom Pritchard to the mix. So they were Skip and Zip with Sonny and the Body Donnas. They got the tag team titles, but I wouldn't call them a legendary tag team. But the hot blonde that was taking them down to ringside, Sonny, started surpassing them in popularity. So Body Donna's kind of floundered while she rose in popularity. Eventually, Chris Candido went to ECW, started getting into drugs. Sable came in the mix, started getting more popular than Sonny. She started getting into drugs and alcohol. It mentions her affair with Shawn Michaels right before she went to ECW with Chris Candido. Their drug and alcohol problems getting way out of control. But Chris taking control of his life, getting off the drugs, getting reinvigorated by the time he was in TNA. But in TNA, breaking his shin of all things. Having to get surgery and then flying home, which somebody should have told him was not a good idea because that causes blood clots, which is what happened to him. He got a blood clot from that fresh surgery and flying that spread to his heart, and sadly Chris Candido passed away. Whereas Tammy Lynn Sitch, still alive, just been dealing with her drug and alcohol problems ever since, even to the point that right now she's currently in prison for accidentally killing somebody in a DUI. Then we get to episode 2, Shattered, the Magnum TA story. Starts out with Magnum TA meeting Buzz Sawyer, who told him to get a wrestling license he would need $10,000, when in reality, not many states require wrestling licenses because it's entertainment, not sport, but the ones that do, it's like $10-20. But because of this, Magnum met somebody else who told him where Buzz Sawyer was, so he went to Buzz Sawyer and demanded that he get something for his $10,000. So Buzz Sawyer trained him a little bit and got him into wrestling. Talked about Magnum TA meeting Dusty Rhodes in Florida, who helped him develop his character. But it was Andre the Giant who came up with the name Magnum TA, considering his name was Terry Allen, and they said you kind of look a little bit like Tom Selleck, who at the time was very famous for the show Magnum PI, so he became Magnum TA. Went into his rivalry with Nikolai Volkov, which springboarded him, made him a main eventer, and everybody knew that this guy was like the next big guy. Ric Flair has talked about it in many interviews how he knew that he was going to be passing the torch to Magnum TA as not only the champion but the top guy in the company. But then Magnum TA got into a really bad car accident. One that made it to where he would never be able to wrestle again. It was amazing he was even able to walk afterwards. It does go into how he did try to get into other areas of wrestling, since he couldn't actually wrestle anymore, but eventually focused his energy into other areas, and he's doing okay now. Then episode 3, Breaking the Cycle, the Graham Dynasty. Talks about the original Graham, Eddie Gossett, becoming Eddie Graham. Big, huge name in the Territory days. Who not only was big in the Territory days as a wrestler, but later he would buy Championship Wrestling from Florida, which was one of the biggest territories at the time, but went into eventually how Eddie Graham committed suicide by shooting himself. But then his son, Mike Graham, tried to carry the territory, trying to run it, but just having a hard time doing that. Especially because around that time, Mike Graham, Championship Wrestling from Florida, kind of got absorbed into WCW. Then it goes into how later Mike Graham's son also committed suicide. And through the grief of this, 2 years after, having lost his father and his son to suicide, Mike Graham committed suicide while wearing his son's boots. So this one just ends as a very tragic story. Episode 4, What Happened to Doink the Clown? Talking about the original Doink the Clown, Matt Bourne. How he was a second-generation wrestler, and how he was going through the territories, but always on drugs, and becoming the original Doink the Clown, the evil clown. The one we all really liked. Because I will say, there was other Doinks after him, but they weren't that interesting, in my opinion. They were okay. But really, even though I was a kid at the time, and I honestly couldn't tell that it was Matt Bourne or whoever it was, I didn't care. I just remember thinking, like, this isn't as fun anymore. But his drugs getting him fired from WWF goes into him getting married twice, having kids, Only one of his kids was actually in this documentary, though. Talks into how he tried to take Doink with him in the Independence, but more of a crazy clown kind of thing. Getting sued but settling because he wasn't getting his royalties, but eventually just doing it anyway. And then it goes into Matt Bourne's death in 2013. That was ruled as an accidental drug overdose. But there's also suspicion that his girlfriend at the time is the one that actually killed him. His daughter is definitely convinced that she did. His ex-wife seems like she thinks so, but not very sure. The sheriff's department where he was living had to just kind of go, we have no evidence, and let it go. Episode 5, The Junkyard Dog. One of my favorites when I was a kid. It talks about the stuff I didn't really see as a kid, like him becoming a huge star in Mid-South Wrestling, which obviously I didn't see because I grew up on the West Coast. That was a territory thing, but also I don't think I was even born around that point. But as he was a huge star in Mid-South, of course WWF started rising, getting out of the territory days, becoming a big global thing, and they wanted the Junkyard Dog, and they got the Junkyard Dog. But when he went to WWF, even though he became a big star, like I remember him, he was a big attraction, he was not the top guy in WWF by far, which some people blame on racism, most people blame on the drugs. I think it was probably a combination of both, to the point that he was let go from WWF and just kind of kept spiraling downhill because of his drug addiction, until his death in a car accident that they believe happened because he was on drugs and fell asleep. Episode 6, The Tragic Fall of Adrian Adonis. It goes into him starting out in the territories, being a tough guy, a badass guy that nobody really wanted to mess with, inside or outside of the ring. But then going to WWF and getting into cocaine and becoming adorable Adrian Adonis, where he played the gay character, which in the 80s meant you were a heel and you're going to be one of those over-the-top, flamboyant, fruity gay people. Not like now where we have some openly gay wrestlers who that's really it. It's not their personality, it's just what they are. But then again, adorable Adrian Adonis was also meant to be kind of funny because he's calling himself adorable and he's fat. Like very out of shape. But then of course him getting let go from WWF, going on to the Independents and getting his life control, deciding he was going to get back in shape, which he had lost about 100 pounds before his death, in a car accident, going to a show in Newfoundland, Canada, and them accidentally swerving off a bridge and into the water. It wasn't just Adrian Adonis, but there was 3 guys in the car with him. Only one survived, who swears there were no drugs or alcohol involved at the time. It was just an accident. Episode 7, Abdullah the Butcher, Legacy of Blood. It goes into him growing up really, really poor. Talk about, of the kids, 3 of them shared a bedroom, whereas one of the kids wanted his own room, and it was the bathroom. He slept on a mat in the tub. And Abdullah goes into the story of how, 2nd grade, he left school because he just wanted to make money. But later getting into martial arts, teaching martial arts, which led to somebody telling him, like, you're a big guy, have you ever tried pro wrestling? And him getting into pro wrestling, where he was very brutal. Back when that was a big deal. Back in the days where we were guaranteed, if Abdullah the Butcher was wrestling,
there will be blood.
And there always was. Always sticking forks in people's heads. Turned out had blades in his fingertips that he would use to cut people. But just always blood, always hardcore, always extreme. And this was back in the days when they didn't do that as much. But it goes into him being successful, making a lot of money, until it goes into the story of Hannibal, the wrestler, who worked with Abdullah the Butcher in Canada until he finally got a WWF developmental contract. He was about to achieve his dream, and they found out he had hepatitis C. And at the time with Hannibal, there was a documentary going on that was supposed to show his rise from an independent wrestler to a WWE superstar. And there was footage on there showing Abdullah the Butcher blading him with dirty blades. From there, he decided to file a lawsuit against Abdullah the Butcher. There was blood tests taken showing that, yes, Abdullah the Butcher had the same strain of Hep C that Hannibal had. Shows the evidence that Abdullah the Butcher was using dirty blades that he'd used on himself and on Hannibal. So it is likely that, yes, Hannibal got the Hep C from Abdullah the Butcher. And he won his court case not because of all the evidence, but because Abdullah the Butcher did not show up, which goes into Abdullah the Butcher's claim that he is illiterate. Abdullah the Butcher didn't go much into the lawsuit, though. He refused to talk about the issues with him and Hannibal, but did talk about how he cannot read. He has a caregiver who confirms that he cannot read. However, he had other wrestlers on there like Mick Foley saying that's news to him that he was illiterate. Like when they traveled together, which he did travel a lot with him back in the day, never had a problem like reading menus or anything like that when they would eat at restaurants. but having his siblings confirm that, yes, he left school at 2nd grade, which meant that if he can read very, very little, I'm not really weighing in on that, whether or not I think he's actually illiterate. It's possible, because there are people who are illiterate who find ways around it so people don't know. But as it stands at the end of this documentary, Hannibal's still bitter, has won his lawsuit, but has yet to be paid a single dime, and there were people weighing in on whether or not he should get paid a single dime. I don't really have an opinion about it. Episode 8, Bam Bam Bigelow, the Beast from the East. Talks about his early days being a New Jersey badass, but how he also told a lot of very exaggerated stories, so who knows how true they were. And then becoming a wrestler, and very quickly after becoming a wrestler, like a year or so into it, gets a contract with WWF. And when they first brought him into WWF, it was as a babyface. He was tagging along with Hulk Hogan, who took him under his wing for a little bit. But goes into how some of the other people in the back were bitter about it. And then there were people like Andre the Giant who just felt like this kid needed to learn some stuff and beat the crap out of him, which led to him deciding to leave WWF, go to the territories, and go to Japan, where he learned a lot. But then him going back to WWF, this time as a heel, which is more around what I remember. That's what I kind of remember about Bam Bam Bigelow, is how he was a heel. I was a kid, so I didn't like the bad guys. I liked the good guys, but I couldn't help but be intrigued by this big, huge guy who could move around like he was one of the smaller guys. And it goes into, of course, his biggest match of his career, the WrestleMania 11 match with Lawrence Taylor, which was a huge deal back then. Back then, they really didn't do that kind of stuff very often. Having a non-wrestler celebrity being in a match, they hadn't done that since Mr. T. And it was crucial at the time because WWF wasn't doing great at the time. But then, of course, he leaves WWF again. He goes to ECW, and it did go into the details of the broken ring incident with him and Taz. I've heard the story many times, but this is the only time I can think of where somebody went into the details of how they pulled that off. They had Taz doing it. I don't have time to go into this review. You'll have to go watch the episode for that. But of course, because of the injuries piling up and all the hurt he was going through, he's getting prescribed Oxycontins by a corrupt doctor who's just a wrestling fan and gives him whatever he wants. And of course, his Oxycontin addiction making him spiral out of control to the point that he gets arrested for driving under the influence with his young daughter in the car, and his wife making him leave. Until a while later when he died of an accidental overdose, which I remember when that happened. I was really sad about that because I was a huge Bam Bam Bigelow fan. Then, probably the most frustrating episode for me, Episode 9, Bash at the Beach 2000. One of the most infamous pay-per-views in WCW history. The one where Hogan came out, Jeff Jarrett laid down in the ring, they basically broke kayfabe, which, I'm not a big kayfabe person, but as a fan, we don't want to see stuff like that. We don't want you telling us, oh, by the way, this is fake, in the middle of the show. Vince Russo comes out, gives the scathing promo on Hogan. Hogan never returns to WCW. Booker T becomes the champion at the end of the night, which I was happy about Booker T being champion, but not really happy about how it went about because it just kind of tainted it. And it goes into the details of what led to this infamous event. Vince Russo, Eric Bischoff working together, the two of them do not see eye to eye on anything about wrestling. Both of them delusional and believing that they were just the greatest things that ever happened to wrestling. Neither one, to this day, can accept that the reality of the situation is you each had one good run. That's it. And anybody can have one good run. But most of what they did hurt wrestling more than it helped. This part, I recommend watching it, but just as a fan, it was upsetting. Because you had Vince Russo talking about what a genius he was, and he could have done better in WCW if it wasn't for everybody else. Because that's Vince Russo. Every good thing that happened in wrestling was somehow his idea. Every bad thing that happened in wrestling was somehow not his fault. And you had Eric Bischoff basically doing the same thing. He was so great. He was so innovative. He just wanted to keep focusing on Hulk Hogan because that's where the money was, even though the fans were telling him, we're tired of it. It got boring. Vince Russo's original idea was Hogan was going to come out, look very strong, but not win the title. And then at the end of the night, Jeff Jarrett was going to get challenged by Booker T, who was going to win the championship. That might have been okay. Still not great, just okay. Bischoff and Hogan's idea, Bischoff being the genius that gave Hogan creative control, was Jeff Jarrett was going to come out, lay down, let Hogan win the title. He was going to get mad, storm off like we saw. And then they were going to have a tournament to crown a new champion. And so it culminated at Halloween Havoc, where Hogan would come out and say, oh, no, you're not the champion. I have the belt. That would have been terrible. But instead, Vince Russo called an audible and did even more terrible by coming out screaming, yelling, cursing about Hulk Hogan when he was not there, and then just saying that match didn't count and there's going to be a championship match with Booker T at the end of the night. Hogan getting mad about him going on an audible, quitting WCW, suing WCW, getting a settlement, and that being that. And again, the entire episode, Bischoff saying my idea was better, Russo saying my idea was better. Both of you sucked, had one good run, let it go. The final episode into episode 10, The World According to Marty Jannetty. Talking about Marty Jannetty, the former tag team partner of Shawn Michaels and the Rockers. And right off the bat, one of his friends in the documentary says, you can't believe 99% of what Marty Jannetty says. It talks about him and Shawn Michaels going to WWF, getting fired because they were just way too wild outside the ring, but then getting hired back, having success until him and Michaels split up. He and other people in the documentary kind of put blame on Michaels, saying that it was because he was kissing Vince McMahon's butt that he got the push and Jannetty didn't. I gotta disagree. Because again, not just Michaels, but other people like Bret Hart, who clearly wasn't a Shawn Michaels fan when he wrote his book, even he went into how Marty Jannetty kept making big mistakes. Like, as much as people want to talk about Shawn Michaels' mistakes, Jannetty's was worse. It was a constant cycle. He'd get fired, he'd get rehired. He'd get fired, he'd get rehired. They'd give him another chance, and he'd keep blowing it very quickly after getting that chance. Not to mention his friends. I get there, his friends talking about that it was only butt kissing that made them think that Michaels was going to be the big star. But honestly, at the time, I remember when they split up, and we pretty much all knew that the star of that tag team was going to be Michaels, not Jannetty. And it even goes into Jannetty talking about his thing that he came up with, GAT, God's amusement toy, saying that when bad things happen to him, it's because God gets bored and decides to do things to Marty Jannetty, which even his friends were saying was just a clear way of Marty Jannetty not taking blame for the stuff that he's done. But, of course, going into all of his downward spirals until later when Shawn Michaels became a Christian, he reached out to Jannetty, invited Jannetty to a Christian conference where Jannetty got baptized, and Jannetty was starting to turn his life around, got to come and do a one-night Rockers reunion with Michaels, which led to him getting a new contract with WWF, but then he had legal issues again. This time a domestic disturbance issue with a girl he was dating, but he was on probation, so that meant he was going to jail. But then goes into his most recent controversies, the stupid crap he would post on Twitter, X, and Facebook, where he basically gave a confession story of a murder, saying that when he was 14, some guy tried to rape him, so fighting him off, he accidentally killed him, and they dumped his body in the river, which was causing controversy because, of course, police hear this, and they're like, well, we got to investigate this. He had some friends saying that they don't think it was true, they think it was just crap he was making up, had some friends saying they absolutely believe that it really happened. Him saying, no, it was just an angle to get me back into wrestling. It was a wrestling angle. It's a very odd angle. But the police department ultimately having to drop it based on no evidence. No evidence of a murder, no evidence of body, no missing persons report from that time, nothing. And it just kind of leaves us there. We'll probably never know if he actually killed somebody or not. So that's kind of the cliff notes on Dark Side of the Ring Season 4. Obviously, I can't give a detailed review of every single episode. That would be a very long video. But, like the other ones, it's really good. But I will say, I didn't enjoy it as much as the others. Probably because, it's just not as new and exciting as, like, the first two seasons. That and this season, just some of the stories, some I really cared about. Like, I was really into the Junkyard Dog story, the Doink the Clown story, the Bam Bam Bigelow story. Bash at the Beach one, I was into it, but more just sitting here watching it and thinking, oh God, Russo, Bischoff, shut up, you delusional idiots. But some of the stories I just wasn't that into. I wasn't that into the Adrian Adonis story. Nothing against Adrian Adonis, but I was never a huge fan. Wasn't that into the Mike Graham story because it was tragic and I feel bad for that family. But I wasn't around that time. I wasn't into that. But that's just kind of how Dark Side of the Ring works. Some of the stories you're going to be super into. Some of them you're not going to be. Especially a fan of the history of wrestling. It is still very good, even for the ones that I'm not that into. Especially because I've talked about reviewing the other seasons. What I love about Dark Side of the Ring, yes, it's telling you about some of the dark stories, but not in a way that is blaming wrestling in and of itself. Which is one thing I don't like about a lot of books, documentaries, and stuff, is they make it seem like wrestling is the reason these people's lives spiral out of control. Dark Side of the Ring's keeping the focus on it was you, maybe circumstances around you that you couldn't help, like car accidents, but it wasn't wrestling's fault in and of itself. So definitely check out Dark Side of the Ring Season 4. It's Davy approved. So there you have it. That's my wrestling review this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure to hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell so you get notifications when I post the videos, and leave a comment. Tell me what you thought of Dark Side of the Ring Season 4. Tell me which episode or season of Dark Side of the Ring was your favorite. Love you guys.